All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. And again, welcome to the North Atlantic Fire Sciences Exchange's student webinar series for spring 2024. My name is Eric Evanson. I'm NAFSE's Science Communications Specialist. And now the goal of our student webinar series is to connect students with the fire and forestry community and establish positive working relationships as well as exchanging knowledge and information. And today I'm very excited to introduce Sam Stockton from West Virginia University. He's going to be kicking off our spring 2024 student webinar series with a talk entitled Operational Terrestrial LiDAR, Incorporating Laser Scanning into Vegetation Monitoring. And now the way it's going to play out today is essentially we're going to go ahead and have Sam give his presentation first, and then we'll follow that up with a Q&A session. And what I'd like you to do, though, is if you come up with some questions during Sam's presentation, feel free to drop those into the chat, and we can again follow up with those questions at the end. And then we'll just finish up the hour with some additional information related to our upcoming talks. We have 3 more in our student webinar series and different ways you can get involved in the student webinar series if you so choose. So what I would kind of like everybody to do here, just before we get started with Sam, is I'd like you just to go ahead and drop in your name and your affiliation into the chat, and we can kind of see who's on the meeting today. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Got a wide range of National Park Service, Nature Conservancy, Fish and Wildlife, many different agencies here from all over. Actually, I have somebody from National Weather Service too, which is great. I always love when they jump on. Okay. Yep, National Park Service, Fire Effects, the Bighorn National Forest. So again, thank you everybody for joining us today. And I think you're in for a real treat today with Sam's presentation. So why don't we just go ahead and get started with that? I'm going to go ahead and let Sam share a little information about himself, and then he'll roll into his presentation for all of us. So go ahead and Sam, take it away.
Very much, Eric. Hello, everybody. My name's Sam Stockton. I am a graduate research assistant at West Virginia University. I'm starting off this seminar series with a fairly short presentation for you all, but I promise I'm happy to answer as many questions as you all have. A little about myself before we get into things here. Um, I started out working as a conservation crew lead in Southeast Utah in the spring of 2020. What a time. These photos are actually from more recent projects of mine. I worked as a range management technician in southeastern Alaska, and I've also done some work outside of my master's degree research with TLS. And I started as a dendrochronologist or doing dendrochronology at Concord University in southern West Virginia. Um, and there's a shot of Utah. The tree in the top left-hand corner will feature pretty heavily. I did a project over the last summer where I was helping create digital doubles of trees using TLS. So I would go out and my presentation today is on single scan methods mostly, but multi-scan methods are also very useful for calibrating vegetation measurements. So that brings us to the question of vegetative structures. Most everybody in the presentation today is associated with some land management agency. So I'm sure you all are familiar with the vital quality that structure of vegetation has in determining things such as airflow, habitat suitability, and succession in the case of disturbance. Both of these images on the screen right now are of that same tree from the last slide. The first, in the top left, is a full digital double scan from 7 different positions that captures the 3D structure of the tree itself. And the second one is a voxelization. When we're talking about the different structure measurements that can be produced from TLS, it's sometimes necessary to normalize the distribution of points within the scan and aggregate the points into voxels or cubic points, or points represented as cubes, in order to have a more standardized structure. Whereas noise or artifacts that should not be in the data can sometimes cause issues within a regular scan. That brings me to the metric that I used to compare my research to these scans to, because once you have a actual structure model of any kind, you have to, of course, compare it to field data that you have collected. In the case of my project, I'm working specifically with the composite burn index and its overall effect on vegetative structure. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the composite burn index, it's a scale and survey system used to match actual conditions on the ground with spectral indices that use near-infrared information or near-infrared imagery to indicate how much mortality or how much loss of greenness has occurred in an area following a fire. And these surveys assess both overall fuel consumption and the amount of mortality on a site. But the thing is, this judging what has died off and how, for example, how blackened vegetation is or how deep burns go is a highly qualitative enterprise. And so having something fine scale that we can sort of uh, indicate a major physical change alongside this more qualitative measurement is super important, which is why TLS is a very valuable tool in this instance. Now, I talked about scans that can be used for different purposes, and in truth, there are far more applications than just single scans for TLS. I'm more familiar with the single scan method, so bear with me. But QSMs are the most exciting to me. These are the digital doubles of the trees themselves that uh, use polygons and different shape files to create the structure of the tree, which can then be entered into different physics models or other types of models that can model biomass accumulation or leaf angle. The voxels, as previously mentioned, are a nice sort of middle ground that cover the geometric shape of a piece of land or vegetation in space without actually having neat corners. The voxels I showed you earlier were each sized to 10 centimeters, but that is within a certain aggregation threshold. So, in reality, many of those voxels actually have finer structures within them. And then there are the single scans, which I will display some here shortly. But these are mostly reliant on point counts, the percentages of points in regard to your target structure, the overall height, which is a great indicator for forest management, the way that the data skews in one direction or another, given the counts in a specific strata or, again, target area. I mentioned here the vertical complexity index, mostly because one of the ongoing issues within using single scan TLS is that we're actively trying to quantify what we are actually seeing in the understory with standardized metrics that we can apply across different sites. And then I mentioned bins here because of the composite burn index works within different height strata to quantify the effects of fire, or to describe the effects of fire, excuse me. And so uh, modifying the viewpoint or the focus of a single scan is very important in order to actually get actionable metrics. Now, the subject of my master's thesis, the work on which is ongoing, is a series of plots from the Wharton State Forest in southeast New Jersey. This figure is taken from a paper from the Northern Research Station, some of which I've had the good pleasure to work with and who've been very helpful to me in my work. Um, it's a series, the overall forest is 43 plots that had not burned for around 82 years. Um, the forest in question is a upland pitch pine community. I believe it's an upland pitch pine community. But it is characterized by extremely dense undergrowth of oaks and occasional seedlings, but mostly overstory dominated by pitch pine that is in decline or was prior to the burn. So the relationships of my initial work in terms of looking at the relationships between the differences that occur over time. These plots have been scanned once prior to the fire, once following the fire, immediately after the fire, a maximum of 16 days. So there was not a growing season in between. And then again during the dormant season after a growing period, and once more, two growing periods after the initial burn. So we've got single scans from all of these points that utilize the same structural metrics. And so it's really comparing those over time because very few studies have actually gone out and collected these scans over multiple years in order to try and quantify the structure more than just a 1 year basis. And also, this is not destructive. You can perform destructive measurements in conjunction with TLS, but as you might know, destructive measurements are much more time intensive. But that work has been fairly illustrative of the fact that the volume measurements do a pretty good job at estimating above ground carbon. So once again, just back to these relationships that are important for understanding understory metrics. Right here, we've got, I was excited to see these trends, relatively low R values, but still, these trends in the data of the overstory complexity and the overstory percent of scan points directly affecting the amount of non-ground points and herbaceous growth points in subsequent years and during the year in question. So kind of initial searches are promising and yeah, I'm still working towards getting more rigorous understory measurements, or not understory measurements, but quantifications of structural variation, because that's really where we're going to see the fine scale effects of fire, where fire does burn heterogeneously on the landscape and hopefully give us a more refined idea of how CBI is actually relevant to regeneration metrics on the ground. Now, I did promise an image here. So if I may, I've got in this little bounding box here, 3 scans overlapped from subsequent years in the same site. Now, part of the issue I run into here is that these are not actively registered, co-registered, but if you were to look near the center of the plot where vegetation is densest on the ground, you can see year to year how, so this is immediately following the burn, and you can see that the ground is pretty bare. The first year afterwards, you start to see the return of vegetation, and this is all quantified through the variation in Z values, that is to say, the verticality of uh, elements in the point cloud. And then 2 growing years prior, or excuse me, following the fire. And you've got different regeneration, or you've got ground fuel starting to reaccumulate. And also, a consistent trend in the data is that the number of points that the scanner classifies as a ground point, that is to say, the lowest points knitted together by a cloth simulation filter, those points consistently decrease alongside CBI. So in that way, it's been a pretty actionable indicator of how much biomass is actually accumulating in the lower strata. And I do hope to further explore the relationship directly between what's measured in the canopy and what's present in the understory to see if this technology is fully viable in that regard, or what ways we can compensate for current gaps in knowledge. Um, that's all I've got for you all this afternoon. I do believe I'm still in the meeting. But yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. I know it was relatively short, but yeah.
Sam, actually, I was wondering if you could put uh, the that 3D scan back on the screen for
Yeah,
us.
for sure. And if there's any specific part of it you would like to see, just shout. Um, oh, beg your pardon. I think you're seeing yourself there. Okay. So as I said, the individual scans do not come co-registered. That is to say, they don't share a common geographic coordinate system, or they don't share a common coordinate system. So in order that's one of the reasons why the binning helps. It's less computationally expensive to just go over things by their relative height as opposed to trying to be more uh, discrete in terms of their location relative to the center of the plot.
And are you able to bring that back up on the screen for us?
Oh goodness. Sorry.
No, that's okay. And if anyone has any, I have a couple quick questions, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to throw those in the chat right now. So my first question then, again, because I'm not too familiar with this process. So how do you, what type of equipment and information do you set up to take these scans? Like
I'm
how,
so glad you asked. As a matter of fact, I have the scanner here at my lab with me. This is the second generation of Leica BLK scanner that was the first generation was used in taking most of these scans. But it's very light, multi-tripod mount, um, and this can be carried from site to site. It's a single push button method for in the field. Um, yeah, and you set this thing down for about 4 minutes. It'll take your scan, and then you're free to toil away once you get back to the lab and start, actually cutting through the scans to see what's what.
and one along the same lines, we did have somebody mention that there's a number of people on this webinar who are not familiar with TLS technology. So would you be able to just do an overview of the tools and methods? And so maybe stepping us through that whole process of how it all works to be able to get this type of imagery.
Yes, of course. So I'll refer back to my scans here. So using an entire post-burn scan here. Um, So, as you can see, looking from the top down, there is only one point of view. A LiDAR scanner operates by sending out near-infrared laser beams in 360 degrees generally. Some are more specialized to only work from certain viewpoints, but um, now, from the time of flight of these laser beams that are sent out, the device records an array of points in space, which is how, if you were to zoom in really close on some of this, you've just got a series of points. I'm not sure how well you can see that. Let me scroll over here. But these are all just single points that are being emitted from the scanner. Beg your pardon. Now these are individual or these are single scans. Um, so as I said, the it's all laser beams sent out from one perspective. But if you'll allow me to root around on my computer here, um, the it is possible to compose larger scans. That will take longer to read in. So this, as I said, this is taken from 7 different perspectives. And so when you have those laser beams all sent out from different locations that are then stuck in the same coordinate system, you get a far more complete vegetation structure that can capture idiosyncrasies in size and texture. The, I mean, really the dividing the point clouds is the hardest part. Most of the and when I say point cloud, I mean the resulting collection of points from the scanner. Um, a lot of software dealing with those is proprietary. And as you can see, like these, even this that 7 different scans, you still have these artifacts of occlusion because if anything gets in between the scanner and your target object, it's going to obscure it and decrease the number of points that actually make contact with and therefore measure the surface of the object you're trying to understand. Uh, yeah, so that's sort of the basics of how TLS works. Um, I see any other questions?
And then who would be like who would you share this information with, or what operational entities are out there that could benefit from this type of scanning?
Well, I noticed so first there's a number of ways to aggregate these scans that are indicative of conditions on the ground that are pretty valuable. Like I know we've got some fire people in the chat today, or in the presentation today. And for example, partitioning the lower parts of this scan can tell you the amount of fuel that is consumed, and then the amount of regrowth or fuel accumulation currently on the ground, going from state growing season after a fire to before and vice versa. You can measure fuel loads on the ground. There have been some really interesting studies because it is a near infrared laser system. Um, those near infrared rays under the right conditions, with the right calibration, can can take fuel measurements by quantifying the moisture in its subjects based on the reflectance of that laser beam. But that's it. Again, it depends on the sensor being used. Um, the Northern Research Station that I've worked with, the Northern or Service Northern Research Station, is very interested in using cheaper models that are easier to purchase and easier to scan with. Um, so you're going to get different metrics based on that. As other than fuel loads, this technology has been used fairly frequently to measure diameter at breast height, or overall canopy openness. It's really useful for getting productivity metrics in the case of forestry, um, or even canopy openness associated with higher biodiversity, mast availability for different browsing animals, and openness for songbird habitat as well.
That's good. That's got a wide variety of different uses. We've got a couple of questions here in the chat from Matthew Rice, who's actually working Bachelor of Science in Arson Investigation, also wrapping up his master's in fire science, explosion investigations. He said, I took this class to get a better understanding of what this field does. Is there any benefit to what you are doing that I could use for fire investigation of forest fires?
I would say that maybe not with these scanners in particular. There's a lot of work being done with, um, I shouldn't say not with these scanners in particular, because you have to deploy these scanners over long range, essentially. You have to walk them out, and so it can be more time intensive. But to understand the dynamics of a fire, I think like immediately before or afterwards, I would use one of these kinds of devices mounted on a flying medium, a drone or a winged drone of some sort, propeller winged drone. Sorry, does that answer the question? Or
Yeah, yeah. So it sounds like there is that possibility. Maybe not the best option, but just another tool to gather information about an incident. If I'm hearing that correctly, Matthew, you can chime back in.
rice,
Yep,
correct?
yep, Matthew Rice. He
Okay.
said yes. Thank you. So
Yeah. So with I guess in terms of if you mentioned having a BS in arson investigation, um, and like I don't know much about that field, but what I can say is that the resolution of these objects does sort of limit them, or of this technology does sort of limit it in order to pick up any kind of like minute ignition locations or anything like that. Um, but because but I think there are definitely some applications that could be had.
excellent. Here's a question from Jennifer Barnes. Actually, if you want to leave that
Oh,
back
by
up,
all means.
just in case there are some more. In single scans, is it possible to use occlusion as a measure of density or thickness of vegetation?
Yes, yes, it absolutely is. Um, so there there are multiple ways to do that, varying from the intensity of the scans that you get back to whether or not a pulse passes through a space without actually intercepting anything. You can measure, there are different ways to measure the pulses, even in single scan mode, of the beams that do not have any returns or pass through, beg your pardon, um, that pass without hitting anything, and that can give you canopy openness in the case of open sky or proportional to distance. Um, that can give you some information as well. And that's where the voxelization comes in handy because if you're looking at just, even with the single scan, because if you're looking at just the point density, that's going to be uneven based on your distance from the scanner. But if you're just looking at this one measurement of inhabited space across your plot, that's going to give you a better idea of something like visibility.
Excellent. Okay. Here's a question from Mariah Mack. Can you get similar vegetation structure information, specifically fuels and understory from satellite or plane flying over LiDAR scans? And are there any recommendations for open source LiDAR?
Yes. The answer is yes. I mean, TLS is going to be a lot more accurate, especially for understory elements. But I'm sorry, I can't remember the author off the top of my head, but there was a really great project put out by some German researchers a couple of years back that overlapped, that used, I believe, open source platforms to overlap both overhead and, or excuse me, TLS and ALS or flown over data to create full renderings, both upper and lower canopy of trees. Um, yeah, it's absolutely you're going to have some things that are easier to read through the understory with TLS, just because you're not getting that laser beam penetration from a flyover method. But yes, you can certainly measure similar things.
Yeah, that's that my before being with the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange, I was a longtime meteorologist with the National Weather Service and an incident meteorologist, and just thinking back to what Mariah mentioned about the satellite technology, just seeing what satellites can see now from above, with whether it be with storms, with fuels and vegetation on the surface. So both from a weather and a fire perspective, the satellite technology just continues to get better and better. So you're getting all these great tools to be able to make these more substantial assessments.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't answer like the open source part of that last
Oh,
question.
sure.
Um,
Mhm.
in all things LiDAR, the LiDAR package in R is your friend. When if you're dealing with more quantitative structural models, you might have to get into a more graphically designated coding language. But yeah. Um, and yeah, no, the Jedi spaceborne LiDAR is absolutely phenomenal. The fact that we can have global coverage of like 2 meter LiDAR. It's still, significantly larger than what I'm talking about here, but uh, uh, these things can be scaled up. So,
Here's another question from Richard, who is a forest fuels specialist, interested in learning more about how to get from field scan to output derivative relative to land management program area. Time lag fuel quantification, percent shrub cover, volume of coarse woody, and then are you able to read all that in there, Sam?
yeah,
Stitching multi-scans together, majority of my field techs can get data, but we have a huge barrier to post-processing. And then how refined do you think processing models need to be? Plant association group, particular to strata of interest, understory or overstory driven. So maybe you want to try to read through there and kind of speak to some of those questions.
yeah, absolutely. So the I with the like time like fuel quantification, that is a little bit more difficult because it also does depend on how fine the resolution is. All of this is dependent on the overall resolution of your scanner. But I would look at, for a lot of these, I would look at ground points. There's some interesting open source data or open source programs out there too for identifying stems of individual plants and then sectioning those out. LiDAR, as I previously mentioned, does a great job of just chopping up height strata. I don't know, like, to be fair, when one says shrub, where I am in West Virginia, it's sometimes different looking than like a chaparral environment. But if you have that really um, connected, or if you have a more contiguous, like ground fuel level to like canopy base height, that will probably make things a bit more difficult. Um, the biggest thing I could say is georeference the if you georeference the individual spots or allow me to grab another material. Uh, when I um when I made those um multi-scan renderings of trees, I had to use location spheres to automatically co-register the scans. I'm I know some folks who are working on something to identify the actual stems of plants and use those to co-register the scans. But yeah, that's one of the things that's really being worked on. And as for how refined do the processing models need to be, um, it really comes down to getting a good combination of data collected in the field, or like traditional survey methods and TLS, because make more specific, uh, once you can like make more specific statements about the interactions of height uh, across regeneration points and that sort of thing Yeah, that it's if you smash together metrics from on the ground in the TLS, you'll get something that lines up with biology.
So hopefully, Richard, that answered your questions. One from Judith: Is there any way to reveal wind damage progress?
Yeah, that would take um, actually no, you wouldn't necessarily need co-registered scans for that because at that point you're depending on it's essentially the same thing as when you're looking at ground fuels consumption. So I believe I'm still sharing my screen. But it's just instead of looking at the lower strata, in the case of wind throw, you would look at the upper canopy and you divide this into bins and then see which, uh, how to what degree alterations occur. And I feel like that would be a pretty good indicator of wind damage. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on right now in terms of fluid dynamic models trying to take into account the more advanced renderings that I mentioned. So, um, yeah, even potentially predicting which areas are most vulnerable to wind throw based on these metrics.
Excellent. Hopefully, Judith, that answered your question. So then, Sam, ultimately, do you have a vibe of where you're wanting to take this information or your research for your work? Is there anything you're particularly working on?
Yeah, so I'm most interested in trying to get as much information out of these single scans as possible, trying to discriminate objects on the ground, or at least get better measurements so that we can better understand structure. Um, and I would if I were to stay on with this for a while, I think I would love to get to the point where I can more actively build out trees into even if they're not like exact measurements of what's on the ground. No model is perfect, so um, yeah. But for now, trying to get as much information as possible. I'd like to work with just more precise ground data too, in conjunction with this, to see because sometimes these things are thrown into the field and um, there's not much data to go along with them necessarily. I've been fortunate in that I've had access to both. Um, but yeah, I would just really love to keep working with this and seeing how it can be used for management in the future, just landscape change through the future.
Excellent. Thank you. Does anybody have any other questions they want to throw in the chat? Excuse me. Sam, would you be willing to put your email in the chat right now?
Absolutely.
So if anyone does have any other kind of follow-up uh, questions, please feel free to reach out to Sam. He'd be more than happy to answer those for you. All right. Any other last questions? All right. Well, one thing I'd like to follow up on for right now is just uh, this was Sam kicking off our spring 2024 student webinar series, and I greatly appreciate that. So thank you, Sam, and thank you everybody for attending today. Just kind of want to let you know that, again, this was the start of the series. We have 3 more talks coming up. So next Thursday, April 11th, we've got Kathleen Stutzman from the University of Vermont who will be speaking. And then April 25th, we go back to West Virginia University with Matt Wozniak, and that again Thursday, April 25th. And then we conclude with Trevor Roper from Columbia University on May 2nd. And if you want to learn more about those particular talks, and for registration, I just put into the chat a reminder of our student webinar series page through the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange. And then also wanted to mention if any of you are interested in wanting to give a presentation and be a part of the student webinar series, or maybe you know of somebody that would be interested in taking advantage of this opportunity, feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to drop my email in the chat as well. And we're kind of all set for this spring, but we're already looking at opportunities coming up in for the fall of 2024 to start up another series. The North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange, again, we're really big into wanting to share information and giving people opportunities, and we just feel like tapping into the student realm to help them with opportunities to connect up with the fire and forestry community is kind of what we're all about. So again, if anyone's interested in being a part of this, I'd love to hear from you. And again, thank you, Sam. Very informative and really kind of started us thinking about this operational tool and information we can gather more data from. So again, thank you. And again, thank you to all of you who had participated as well. So feel free to reach out to Sam or myself. And again, connect up with the next talks that we have for our student webinar series for the spring of 2024. So we'll stick around for the next couple of minutes, but feel free to drop off if you like, or if anyone has any questions, again, we'll be around for a couple more minutes to answer anything else you have. Other than that, have a great day. And again, thank you for being part of today's student webinar series.